I'm going to begin with a confession. I have never felt anything close to love for my parents. That might sound cruel, but years of standing in the shadow of their golden child, Megan, destroyed any illusions I had about family loyalty. I was 19 when they kicked me out so she could have my room. She was only 7 at the time, but she was already the center of their world, and I was just the inconvenient leftover from a previous phase in their marriage. They told me there was no space for me, that I'd outstayed my welcome. They said I should be grateful they'd kept me around that long, considering how little I gave back. I didn't argue. I'd spent my teenage years trying to please them and failing. I had worked part-time jobs to buy my own clothes, paid for my phone, and never asked for extras. None of that seemed to matter. Megan needed her own creative space, and apparently, I was too old to live at home anyway. I left with everything I owned shoved into a trash bag and a backpack. There was no tearful goodbye, no guilt or regret on their faces. They were just relieved I was gone. For a while, I felt nothing but numbness. Then, resentment took over, followed by anger. I was lucky enough to crash on a friend's couch until I found a cramped studio apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I juggled 2 jobs, took night classes, and vowed to never let them see me fail. My parents never called to check on me, never asked if I was okay. It hurt, but over time, I got used to it. I graduated with a degree in accounting and landed an entry-level position. It didn't pay much, yet it was a stepping stone. I learned the ropes, worked insane hours, and slowly climbed the ladder. Along the way, I promised myself that one day I would show them they were wrong to bet everything on Megan. I didn't think about her much, but I knew she was growing up with every advantage and a family that adored her. Good for her. As for me, I was determined to build a life I could be proud of. Years passed without any contact. I started dating a guy named Alex, who helped me see that not all families were as messed up as mine. He introduced me to his parents, and they were warm, caring people who treated me like a daughter from day one. The contrast was jarring, and I admit I cried the first time Alex's mom gave me a hug for no special reason. Part of me wanted to reach out to my own parents, but another part of me remembered the cold looks and the scorn in their voices. I decided to focus on the new life I was creating. I got engaged to Alex, and we planned a small wedding. I didn't invite my parents. I knew they wouldn't come unless Megan was involved, and I didn't want to see them playing happy family while I stood there, an afterthought at my own celebration. Everything changed last year. I'd been married for a while and was establishing my own accounting firm. Alex and I were saving up for a house when I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Usually, I ignore unknown callers, but something told me to pick up. It was my mother. Her voice was shaky, tense. She told me Megan had run away from home. She was only 13. Apparently, she'd been acting out, getting into fights at school, and threatening to leave. My parents said they woke up one morning and she was gone. They were desperate for help. My mother confessed they didn't know who else to turn to. My father also got on the phone, and his voice cracked with panic. They asked if I had any idea where Megan would go. They explained that Megan believed I had abandoned them, but they still hoped I might be willing to help. The phrase, "Megan believes you abandoned us," stuck in my head. It was such an obvious lie. If anything, I was the one who had been forced out. They must have told her some twisted story to make me the villain. I hesitated, torn between telling them to deal with it themselves or trying to find some way to help Megan, who was still my sister despite everything. In the end, I asked them what they wanted from me. They begged me to come home to help search the neighborhood, maybe call any acquaintances who might have seen her. They thought she might have run to me, but I had no clue where she was. Part of me felt furious that they dared to contact me only when their precious golden child needed rescuing. Another part of me was worried for Megan, because 13 is too young to be out alone with no plan. I decided to drive to my hometown. Alex came with me, and as we pulled up to my parents' house, I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The same front door I'd walked out of with a trash bag was now a portal to their desperation. My mother looked older, more tired, and my father had streaks of gray in his hair. They led me inside, and I saw the walls covered in pictures of Megan at various stages of childhood. Megan smiling in a dance costume, Megan blowing out birthday candles, Megan holding a trophy. Not a single photo of me. It stung, but I kept my face impassive. My mother offered me a seat as if we were guests. She explained how Megan had been rebelling for months, skipping classes, hanging out with kids who got into trouble. She said Megan constantly asked about me, and they'd told her I was too busy to visit. They clearly wanted to paint themselves as victims of a difficult teenager, but I saw the pattern. They'd spent years idolizing her, and now she was pushing back against their expectations. I forced myself to ask what the plan was. They looked at each other, then my father spoke, his voice cracking as he explained that they wanted me to go look for Megan. He believed she might be in a nearby city, possibly crashing at a friend's place or wandering the streets. They had a few addresses. My mother said, "She adores you, even if you never came to see her. You can talk sense into her." Alex squeezed my hand under the table, silently asking if I was okay. I didn't respond. I told them I'd see what I could do. They looked relieved, but there was also a flicker of something like shame in their eyes. Over the next day, Alex and I drove around the city, checking the addresses my parents had. We talked to a few of Megan's friends, but none of them knew where she was. I left my number, told them to call if they heard anything. Some kids seemed to know more than they let on, but they wouldn't talk to an adult who showed up out of nowhere. I felt a strange mix of responsibility and resentment. I hated that my parents had pinned all their hopes on me, yet I also worried about Megan. She was a kid who had been fed lies about me, and she might be in danger. By the third address, I was exhausted, ready to collapse. That was when I saw a small figure ducking behind a dumpster. I approached cautiously, and there she was, Megan, looking frightened and defiant, clutching a backpack. Her eyes widened when she recognized me. I knelt down and spoke softly. I asked if she was okay, and her voice trembled as she demanded to know why I had never come home. She accused me of abandoning the family, of leaving her to deal with everything alone. I told her the truth, that I was kicked out, that I never wanted to leave her behind. She seemed skeptical, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I offered to take her somewhere safe, maybe buy her a hot meal and let her talk about whatever was on her mind. She wiped her eyes and nodded. Alex waited in the car while Megan and I walked together. She was silent at first, but after we got some food, the floodgates opened. She admitted she felt suffocated by our parents' constant attention, that she never asked for the pedestal they put her on. She asked why I never told her my side of the story. I said I was never given a chance, that our parents cut me off completely. I mentioned how they'd kicked me out at 19, how I'd struggled to survive, and how I'd spent years building my life back up. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she confessed that she'd heard whispers at school, rumors that I left because I couldn't handle family obligations or because I hated her. She'd always wondered what she'd done wrong. Hearing the truth left her stunned. I realized in that moment that Megan was just as much a victim of their manipulation as I was. She clung to me, repeating that she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she was a child caught in the crossfire. She asked if she had to go back home, and I didn't have a clear answer. I told her we'd figure it out together. We took her to a motel and got her a separate room. She was only 13, and I didn't know the legal implications of harboring a runaway, but I also couldn't, in good conscience, drag her back to a home she felt trapped in. I used my phone to call my parents. My mother picked up, frantic and demanding to know where Megan was. I told her Megan was safe. My mother insisted we bring her back immediately, but I said Megan needed space. She started blaming me for meddling, calling me irresponsible, and saying Megan belonged at home. I snapped and reminded her that they'd made it impossible for me to be part of the family. She spewed something about me poisoning Megan's mind. I hung up and turned the phone off. Alex and I spent the night making sure Megan was calm. The next morning, I told Megan she had a choice. She could return to our parents if she felt ready, or she could stay with us for a bit while we sorted out a more permanent solution. She hesitated, clearly torn, but ultimately asked if she could come with Alex and me. We drove her back to our apartment. Over the following days, I tried to find a legal way to keep Megan safe, maybe have her temporarily under my guardianship. I consulted a lawyer friend who warned it would be complicated. My parents began calling non-stop, leaving voicemails about how I was kidnapping Megan. They even threatened to involve the police. I decided it was time for a more direct approach. I called them and told them I would meet them in public, somewhere neutral. They agreed. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in town. When we arrived, my parents were already seated, looking pale and anxious. I'd told Megan to stay in the car with Alex. As soon as I sat down, they started demanding that I return their daughter as if she was an object. I kept calm and told them that Megan wanted to stay with me for now. My mother hissed that I was brainwashing her. My father threatened to call the authorities. I told them to go ahead. I would gladly explain how they had kicked me out at 19, left me homeless, and now expected me to fix their mess. I made it clear that Megan was not going back unless she wanted to. If the police got involved, I would tell them everything. They looked furious, but there was fear in their eyes too. I suspected they didn't want their dirty laundry aired in court. They tried a new tack, claiming they'd always loved me, that kicking me out was a misunderstanding. I nearly laughed at that. I reminded them about the trash bag. I recounted how they never once called or checked on me. My mother's lip quivered and my father stared at the table. They insisted it was for my own good, that I needed to learn responsibility. I pointed out the absurdity of that excuse. Eventually, they offered to let me move back into the house if it meant Megan would come home. I declined. I told them I had my own life, my own place, and I didn't need their charity. They started to cry, which might have moved me once, but not anymore. They had used up all my sympathy years ago. I stood, telling them Megan could decide for herself. If she wanted to return, I wouldn't stop her. If not, I'd do whatever it took to keep her safe. They followed me outside, tears turning into anger again as they spotted Megan in the car. My father demanded that she come home. She slid down in the back seat, looking terrified. I stepped between them and the car door, meeting my father's gaze without flinching. He barked at me to move, but I refused. I said, "If you want to talk to Megan, do it calmly." My mother tried to push past me, screeching about how I'd turned their daughter against them. Alex climbed out of the driver's side, telling them to step back. My parents froze, suddenly aware of how this looked to bystanders. A few curious people were already watching from inside the coffee shop. They tried a softer approach, calling Megan's name, telling her they loved her. She burst into tears, covering her face. I told them that was enough, that they were overwhelming her. They looked defeated, but they stepped back. I got into the car and asked Megan if she wanted to say anything. She shook her head, eyes red and scared. I told her I'd drive her back to my place. My parents watched us leave, shouting after us that we were making a huge mistake. I felt an odd sense of power. For once in my life, I was in control of the situation. At home, Megan collapsed onto the couch, crying so hard she could hardly breathe. I sat beside her, rubbing her back. She apologized for causing trouble, for not believing me sooner. I told her she had nothing to feel guilty about. Then she asked if I would help her find a more permanent way to live with me, because she didn't trust our parents anymore. I said I'd do what I could, but warned it could get messy. She nodded, determined. I recognized the same fire that once fueled my own escape. In the following weeks, I started the paperwork, reached out to social services, and prepared for a fight. My parents kept calling, leaving messages alternating between threats and pleas. They claimed they were sorry, that they'd do anything to have Megan back. I didn't believe them. It was too little, too late. Megan told me she didn't want to speak to them unless it was in a controlled environment, so we arranged a family mediation session. They showed up, looking chastened, but still tried to guilt-trip Megan with tearful stories of how they'd sacrificed everything for her. She wasn't swayed. She calmly stated that she wanted to stay with me, at least until she turned 18. My father accused me of poisoning her, but the mediator saw through it. My parents had no legal grounds to force Megan home if she was adamant. We hammered out a temporary agreement while the formal process continued. My parents were humiliated. Their golden child no longer wanted to be under their roof. Over time, word spread among relatives and neighbors about what had happened. I didn't hold back the facts. People learned how I was kicked out and how Megan ran away. Gossip circulated, and my parents' reputation took a dive. They tried to spin it, saying I was ungrateful and rebellious. But the truth was out. I watched them flounder socially. The friends who once admired their perfect family began to see cracks. Relatives who had barely spoken to me started reaching out, offering support or apologies. I didn't bother to console my parents. They made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. For me, the real vindication was seeing Megan find her footing. She enrolled in a new school, started therapy, and slowly opened up about the pressure she'd felt to be perfect. I resolved to finalize things in court. My parents tried to fight, claiming it was in Megan's best interest to return home, but she refused to see them outside official mediation. The judge listened to her testimony, reviewed the evidence of my forced eviction, and granted me temporary guardianship. My parents seethed, but they lacked any real leverage. Megan was safe, and I intended to keep it that way. After everything, I felt the bitterness inside me transform into a cold satisfaction. They had betrayed me, favored Megan, and then lied to her about my disappearance. Now, I watched them face the consequences of their own actions. People judged them, they lost respect in the community, and their precious daughter wanted nothing to do with them. They had no more power over me. That was my revenge. Living well, protecting Megan, and letting them endure the shame they brought upon themselves. I refused to offer forgiveness because they had shown no genuine remorse or willingness to change.